everything that's going on with COVID, but it's not going to go away. And what we're seeing with telemedicine is going to be the beginning of a new kind of revolution, I guess you could call it, or adoption and acceleration of that remote telemedicine way of doing business. And because of that, we know that it's happening so rapidly. We decided to have this webinar so we could help you understand, if you are in that industry, if you do have an agile, fast-moving company, that's our sweet spot. That's who we help. So hopefully you'll get some good stuff out of this about how to secure your environment.
Excellent. Well, Lou, I think maybe we'll just start with you for our first panel question, and then as we go through, we can unmute folks with questions, and maybe we just reserve kind of Q&A towards the end. The first question, meeting HIPAA compliance is not equivalent, obviously, to being secure. Many people mistake it, I think, as security. In that case, what measures really need to be considered when developing a security strategy for a telemedicine application company?
Sure. So to the point of HIPAA, it's one of these regulations that I think has not been implemented in the best fashion. There's a number of items for HIPAA that are excellent that you need to have, contingency planning, security awareness training, things like that. But since being implemented in '96 and over high tech and some of the other modifications that have been made, it's still not strong enough as a regulatory framework for healthcare companies to be, as secure as possible. So what I would say is, rather than looking for HIPAA compliance, which is kind of the gold standard right now for cybersecurity. When I say gold standard, we don't consider it a gold standard. I mean that's what people aim for, companies and organizations aim for when they are in healthcare. I would say look at something more tangible, something like the CIS Top 20 controls. So one common thread with all compliance regimes is that one must have certain controls in place to meet the control standards and pass an audit, for instance, if you're doing ISO 27001 or SOC 2, things like that. Same with HIPAA, it's got certain controls that you have to meet. If you conform to something like actual security, and that's where we stress the point that compliance is not security, you're going to become secure and you'll be able to hit those compliance targets because you're putting the proper controls in place and you're able to provide evidence that you're actually doing that. So, for instance, one great place to start on the CIS Top 20 is knowing what you have from a hardware and software perspective. Specifically in the healthcare industry, I can say that we're an incident response firm, and we've done some IRs in some very interesting environments. One IR we did not too long ago involved healthcare and kind of a hospital environment. And what happened there was we found there were third parties that had equipment in there that they didn't even know how the network was segmented. They didn't understand what was on those third parties. We found malware infections that were over a year old on different third parties vendors' equipment. And one of the reasons for that was that the hospital didn't really understand what they had. They also didn't understand where the responsibility was across different vendors, what the security requirements were. Everyone's signing a BAA, but that's not making people secure. That's just kind of a contractual thing that has to happen, and no one's really verifying that. So knowing what's within your environment and knowing who's responsible for it, that's one example where you're getting security. But once you start to do that, there's so many requisite effects and benefits that come from that. That's when you can start to actually provide evidence that, hey, we are secure, we are hitting these controls that we need to hit, but we're actually, and we're providing the evidence for it. And then you can undergo any kind of different security compliance standard. So I would say, yeah, knowing what you have, having visibility of your environment through logging and monitoring, proper logging and monitoring, having an incident response plan, being prepared for an incident proactively rather than reactively, that's huge. And healthcare is getting hit very, very hard. I mean, the National Health Institute of Health over in the UK, they are, it's actually the government is protecting them now because anyone that's coming up with a vaccine is actually getting, there's a lot of attackers, people looking at that. You know, cyber is just absolutely front of mind, and two industries are getting hit very, very hard. One would be utilities, and that's been, you know, just a known thing for a while now. And now increasingly it's healthcare. So healthcare has to step up its game. HIPAA is not the answer, you know, to summarize. Real security is. And so looking at real security versus trying to hit HIPAA compliance is really the name of the game.
Oh, that's great, Lou. You know, Kim, I know that you have great experience in this area. What kind of security controls should be assessed really to minimize the risk from here on out?
Okay, well, that's a really broad question, so I'm going to try and break that down just a little bit, and piggyback off of what Lou has already stated. First of all, when we're talking about you know, securing telemedicine technology and platforms, there are so many moving parts. And I will start by saying this to everyone that's on the line. You know, embedding security from the very beginning is very important, because at some point you're going to have to defend the security posture of your product and service. And if you have little to no idea what that posture is factually, trying to defend it in a security review with a customer is going to be disastrous for you. So I will say that for you right off the bat. And I know that, and just to give a little history in regards to what is going on with telemedicine, because I know it's really changed because of COVID. Telemedicine, as we all know, the technology has been around for decades, and there's always been a need for it, but it's been slow growing. And a lot of that has to do because of, you know, payment, you know, how telemedicine vendors are and providers are reimbursed. Was very little. That is changing. And one of the things is that I currently sit on the board for a lot of telemedicine companies, not to say a lot, but quite a few telemedicine companies. And I do security assessments for local VCs. And I can tell you there has been an increase in VCs funding telecommunication companies in the last 3 months, significantly. You probably already heard yesterday, I think it's Helios Health out of Africa got $10 million in Series A funding from the San Francisco VC. So I want to throw that on there, because I expect moving forward from this point that we're going to see an increase in telemedicine technologies. And the issue with that is that with this increase, there's always the momentum to get to market as soon as possible. And one of the things that is usually on the back burner while that happens is developing a secure product and service. And so while it's really important to understand, okay, what are, you know, the compliance requirements, HIPAA, you know, there, whatever other regulatory requirements, state data, ISO, NIST, at the end of the day, a lot of people, a lot of startup companies will get overwhelmed. They simply don't know what they have to comply with. And this is why it's you know, I'm going to put a shout out here to Lou's group. When you utilize a service like CDG, they're able to go in and look at, okay, these are all the things that you potentially need to comply with. But in all actuality, you may not need to comply with everything in those regulatory requirements. So that's important to bring someone with that expertise so that they can literally focus on, as a startup company, what do you really need to focus on? Now, with that said, one of the biggest mistakes that telemedicine companies are making right now is they're not building security into their software development lifecycle. And that starts with, you know, looking at software characterization flaws, you know, in third party or in-house software, what you're using. You know, you got to look at the you know, the breakdown of all the processes, the data stores, the data flows, you know, the trust boundaries. But what's happening instead is you know, they think of this great idea and there's a great need, and they might go with a cloud hosting vendor like AWS or Azure. A lot of healthcare companies are moving to GCP because of BigQuery. But whatever the choice is, they sign a BAA and they think, okay, we can build on this platform and we will be secure. That is the furthest from the truth. You have to build the controls into your software development lifecycle, and it starts with threat modeling. A popular threat modeling methodology is STRIDE. And for those of you that don't know, that stands for spoofing, tampering, I'm trying to remember off my own head, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and what is the elevation of privilege. You need, when you're building your software or your product, you need to make sure that you're designing it in a way that those issues, those potential vulnerabilities are not going to be built into, they're going to not be built into your product or service, because eventually you're going to have to fix them. And like anything else with tech debt, security debt can be very, very expensive if you have to come back and re-engineer everything. So part of this is, why are they not doing this? Why are companies not building security into their products and services and the proper security controls? Part of it is skill set. Not understanding how to do a threat model, not knowing how to actually do vulnerability scans for security vulnerabilities, and not knowing how to do secure coding. Now, these are all things as a young company or even an existing company, because these still exist in well-established enterprise companies. You have to know how to do these things. Your engineers know how to do secure coding. Your architects need to know how to design systems that think of these things in advance. And you need to train to make sure that you're not re-entering the same issues over and over again into the software development lifecycle. And your architectural analysis. I'll just obviously in telemedicine products. Transmission security is very important. What type of switching are you using? Store and forward. If you are, how are you securing those intermediate nodes? If you're just using cutthroat technology switching, how are you ensuring that there's the transmission, the integrity of the transmission? So these are all things you need to think of. Now, I would like to just say, add on to this, that again, with your architectural analysis, again, looking at, how you're securing your Bluetooth or any type of other, short range wireless technology, your VTC. So if you're using a vendor that is using Zoom as part of their product, or you're using it, Zoom came out with their healthcare product a few years ago, but what we've learned is, well, it's not really secure, right? Or there were some pretty big security issues. So, these are all things you need to take into consideration, including integration with other healthcare products, PACS systems, CPOE systems, workflows, mobile apps. These are all things that are part of a security architectural analysis that you need to consider when you're building your product and service. Lastly, I will just say, one thing that I will bring up, in 2013, I had the opportunity, while I was the CISO at Bosch, to go to Brussels and speak to the European Commission on the first draft of GDPR. And that was on behalf of COSIR, which is the European Union's telemedicine trade union. And what we learned when we were there presenting is that a lot of these regulatory requirements, like when you look at HIPAA or you look at any kind of regulatory requirement, they're largely built by legislators, developed by legislators who have no or very little understanding of security. So a lot of times this legislation will go into place and you're sitting there as, trying to figure out, okay, how does this compliance requirement translate into a security control? It's not always an easy thing to do. So if you don't know how to do that, I definitely say get some external help. CDG can help with that. Get somebody that can come in and help you with that, because it's not it's not a black and white thing. It doesn't translate very easy. Sometimes it takes some discussion to do that. So I will leave it at that, and hopefully I've covered a few things. Oh, but I will, one more thing, sorry, risk assessment. Start with your risk assessment. Number one thing, people don't do that. So part of the, after you've done your threat modeling, you've done your risk assessment and your mitigation, not everything has to be fixed all at once, but, start a plan on how you plan to fix those and correct those to resolve eventually. So there we go.
Excellent recommendations. Thank you, Kim. And we'll certainly open it up for questions here when we're all done, as I'm sure folks may have some questions for you. Connor, I know that you are the king of, understanding how to marry this agile development with cloud security. So if you could maybe enlighten the audience on, how we can actually enable agile development in a secure way.
Yes, I think it would help if I took myself off mute. First of all, I just want to, Kim, that's incredible. The sheer volume of expertise that you have in this particular space of medicine. I mean, you've not only been like a CISO for like every hospital, but also have that fact that you went in there on behalf of the telemedicine working group to have the first draft from GDPR. That's just incredible. So again, just thank you so much for being on the panel here today. And so what you say really carries a lot of weight. Now, when it comes to something that Kim mentioned, I think Lou also touched on this, is that like, here we are dealing with an entire market space where we're trying to say, how do we take something that is an older infrastructure, environment, cultural mindset, medicine, things generally move a little slower in the medical space. And now we've kind of put this re-kicked into gear telemedicine, and now it's adopting all the same patterns and expectations that you get from a startup, and it's coming through. So there's one of the reasons I think we're seeing some of the problems that we're seeing is there's like a cultural clash between the environments that they're trying to develop, we're developing products for, and the technology toolset mindset of these companies that are coming in developing these newer telemedicine applications. So to what Kim was saying earlier though, it doesn't necessarily have to be an either or. You can start with the very beginning of the life cycle with these risk assessments. Now, risk assessments sound terribly boring. They are not the most exciting thing in the world, but if you do put a technical spin around this, and instead of focusing on the legislative portion of this or the control of the HIPAA compliance focus, but you look at the technical focus, and as Kim mentioned, Stride is a great way of doing threat modeling. This is something that can really invigorate the developers inside the developer community inside your telemedicine company, so that they can say, great, take ownership of this and recognize, now I see where lateral movement would be, the Stride-LM. And it's like, oh, great, I really want to make sure that when our client one talks to us there and then someone wants to exploit this, they can't move inside the environment, right? It's totally contained and isolated. That's a really actually technically fun problem to solve. So by bringing in Stride and other threat modeling things at the beginning of the life cycle, we have the ability to enable developers to think security first, and then they get to see this product, this baby that they've created, go all the way through to release. I think that's just an important thing to realize, is that if we start with the compliance angle, it kind of feels like we're showing up with a hammer and we're telling everyone they're doing things wrong. But if we start up with a threat modeling, we start with an empowering conversation to developers, then we start to kind of unlock this agile mindset of the developing community that we have inside these telemedicine companies. So just that's one thing I wanted to highlight there, with the power of using something like Stride early on. Now, there's another thing here. We are at this explosion of telemedicine, right? Like, as Kim was saying, this has been around for decades. I think Lou mentioned, like, so both of them mentioned been around for a long time, but now we see this massive explosion. I get the sense that this is not, verifiable, but this is just a Connor prediction, that in the same way that financial services was absolutely called critical infrastructure after 9/11, and all of this regulatory effort came under protecting critical infrastructure. It was called that before, but it kind of really carried a lot of weight after 9/11. The post-COVID, telemedicine is going to be called, it's going to be something similar, right? So telecommunications, telemedicine is going to become kind of its own style of critical infrastructure, because we're recognizing the power of being able to take doctors and bring them beyond their geographical boundaries. So there is a sense that we are in this turning point in this industry, this one that's been slowly growing and is about to receive a lot more funding. It's going to attract a lot more talent, and we're going to solve a lot more cool problems with this. But with that's going to come the responsibility that us as security professionals and owners of telemedicine companies need to make sure that we're handling that responsibility correctly, because there is going to be a big shift in this. And that comes to, so as we look at this, we're going to start to see, again, what we've seen in other industries is there's going to be a conflict of priorities. Every company in the world wants more features faster, right? Wouldn't it be great if all of a sudden you just turned up one day and your app was fully developed, your service was fully functional, and it was running at speed of light? Well, that's what we want, but we're not there yet. But one of the ways that we can get there is really through what, Amy, you were talking about with that agile methodology, right? Where we're really thinking about like, how do we take things, break it down to its smaller components? But here's the key thing, bringing it through a consistent process. So it goes from conception to delivery all the way through, and we release that code into production. Now, this is the magic, right? As we are either security professionals where we're helping implement these pipelines, or on our panel, we may have business leaders who are trying to figure out how is it that I align these incentives. The magic of this whole thing is having a release pipeline. It's having a CI/CD pipeline where people can go from conception of concept all the way through their coding practices and then to release. And then along each step of the way are the technical gates. You're doing static code analysis. Wonderful. Now we know you don't have any basic misconfigurations in the way your app is configured. Do we get a little further? Okay, do we have dependencies on a third-party library that has embedded vulnerabilities, or are we not licensed to use that third-party library? Then we move on to dynamic scanning, and then we move on to resiliency testing, and then we move on. But all the way, we have this consistent pipeline that we've got all these checks going on. And if we are in a place where we can embed that into the culture, as Kim was saying early on inside the telemedicine companies, then we're getting the benefit of speed, we're getting the benefits of resiliency, predictability, but without the security debt that we see so many companies now taking on as they're trying to get that speed. So I would just, my challenge to everyone on this call is to think about, if you were in that position of influence inside a telemedicine company, instead of saying, here are 114 or here are 120 things that you need to do across the organization, I would say let's focus on the control plane of like, let's bring that CI/CD pipeline as one of the many tools, but one tool to say at least we can have control of how that code is kind of getting formed, being secured and being made more resilient, and then being released into the wild. That is just something I think is a practice that if every telemedicine company in the world adopted it, they would be able to see the benefits of scale like Zoom without all the technical debt that unfortunately was exposed recently by Zoom. So those are a few thoughts I had on how telemedicine can achieve the objectives and the outcomes of an agile company.
Excellent. Thank you, Connor. Well, perhaps someday we can really, fully confidently say that security could be a revenue generator then, right? In that case.
Absolutely.
Mr. Gene, you are last but certainly not least. Thank you for joining us. What I love about Gene's background is that he comes from many years working with a healthcare insurance provider. And as many of you in telemedicine are aware that, obviously the insurance providers have played a huge part in adopting telemedicine to engage with their customers and, really break down some of the communication barriers to their members. Perhaps you can spend just a few minutes, Gene, recapping your experience securing third-party telemedicine applications and talking through some of your experiences, working on the side of the payer.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. A lot of very good thoughts has already been shared here, and some of the things I'll be talking about may sound repetitive, but hopefully I'll provide a little bit different perspective, kind of the health insurance perspective. And so BAA came up a number of times today during this discussion. And of course, as several of you already said, BAA doesn't mean security. BAA is just a piece of paper that that the company promises to notify you to when they have data breach. They promise to share data only as allowed by HIPAA and allowed by contract. And they promise to implement reasonable technical, physical, and administrative security controls. And of course, what one company may find to be reasonable doesn't mean that's what's reasonable for you. And also, I think Lou made a good point that HIPAA doesn't mean security either, right? And as Kim said, HIPAA was written by lawyers and politicians, right? It wasn't written by security professionals, who I guess it looks like they definitely haven't been consulted enough. And that's why there are some really strange things that you can see in HIPAA. For example, they have something like risk assessment, which is a very one of the fundamental programs, right, in any company under information security program. That's one of the key elements, right? But then they, along the same lines, they have something like setting idle timeout to specific settings, and this really makes it look very odd, right, when you put on the same list items that have completely different level of significance. So the way that the health payers, the health insurance companies look at this is they expect their vendors, like telemedicine companies, to have controls that go above and beyond HIPAA. And every time you have a company that, let's say, wants to work with, your Anthem, Humana, whatever it is, they will do an assessment to understand, okay, what is the risk of sending my patients, my health plan members' data to this particular vendor. And the approach is not simple HIPAA compliance checklist, right? But the approach usually is follow the data, and I think this is the approach I use, right? Because your data security doesn't stop at whatever the portal that patient interfaces with, right? You have to follow the data all the way through from the point when the data was originated or created to the point until it was destructed. And you have to follow all copies of that data. And what it means for telehealth, right? It's you have to consider things like right, cloud security, for example, right? Where the system's hosted, right? What Connor talked about secure SDLC, right? How does the vendor develop its applications? How does the vendor ensure that these applications don't have any vulnerabilities? And again, Connor talked about those things: integration of security in your CI/CD pipeline, doing penetration testing, right, to make sure that your application doesn't have any exploitable vulnerabilities. And again, application here, I'm talking more about something like member portal, right, where your patients log in. But then it doesn't stop there, right? You have your data backups. Are those data backups stored on AWS in this example? Are they stored encrypted? Do you encrypt your data on your databases? For how long do you retain your data? What happens to this data after a certain period of time? How do you dispose that data? And again, it doesn't stop there. Then you look at broader number of integrations, like for example, if you use Zoom, right? Do you have your BA with Zoom? And that's just a compliance portion, but also how do you ensure that Zoom has appropriate security controls in place to protect your patient's data? And there are several ways of doing it, but organizations need to have a third-party vendor risk management program, right? And depending on the vendor, for example, you probably won't be able to do your own risk assessment of AWS, because if all of their hundreds and thousands of customers going to do assessments, they're probably going to be out of business because they won't be able to accommodate that. But at least you need to do annual review of their SOC 2 reports that they make available to their customers, right? To make sure that, and monitor those reports to make sure that the controls that you expect your cloud provider to have in place are in place, and those controls are operating effectively. Then you have to follow your data on any third-party integrations, right? Your EHR systems, for example. Same approach. How do you ensure that your EHR vendor has appropriate controls to protect your patient's data? And then what's usually the weakest point in this whole chain when you follow this data is your providers. A lot of telehealth companies, because most of them are just individuals that work on contract basis with telehealth providers, often that's the business model. And how do you ensure that data that these providers, right, collect on your patient, what devices are they using? Do you have any control over those devices? What if that device gets lost or stolen? Does the mobile app they use store user data on those devices? Do you have the ability to remotely wipe that device to get rid of any sensitive data? Do you even know if the device is locked? So all these different components, and there's usually a lot of them, and a lot of them get overlooked as well. So simple example is a lot of companies use appointment scheduler, third-party provider, right? And a lot of times they don't necessarily look at that provider as a critical provider from HIPAA perspective. However, if you look at definition of PHI, it also includes information about healthcare services provided. And it's a big misconception because a lot of people think that, well, it doesn't provide any information about person's health or personal information. However, even the fact that a certain person has an appointment with a doctor, it's already PHI information. So how do you ensure that your calendar, right, scheduling software provider is also HIPAA compliant? Because they often don't, those providers, they often don't see themselves either as a critical component to other organizations. And in most cases, the security on within infrastructure of those providers is not as strong as some other companies that actually do realize that they operate in regulated space versus, again, someone like calendar provider, they think of themselves as non-regulated industry. But once you as a healthcare company sign an agreement with them, start using their services, and one of the same BAA, now they become under HIPAA's business associate and have to comply with all the same regulations. And I think another thing is what often gets overlooked is many times, again, healthcare companies, they very focused on HIPAA and often forget other regulations that they also have to comply with, although HIPAA usually is the main one. But they process other kinds of data like PII, personal identifiable information, and different states have different PII regulations. And of course, Europe has GDPR and California has CCPA. And there are other laws. Most states, I think 30 plus states, have their own PII protection regulations. A lot of healthcare companies take payments from patients, right? So you have a PCI component as well. And again, it's very often because companies are so focused, healthcare companies are so focused on HIPAA that other requirements and other regulations often get overlooked. So these are some thoughts I had. Hopefully this is helpful.
Yeah, no, that's great insight. I can speak firsthand coming from an EHR company, transcription, as well as a combination of dictation and RCM in those days of Obamacare. And it's, when you start to look at where PHI is actually held and looking at the data trail amongst all those vendors and when that industry consolidation among vendors happens, it's definitely a security, it should be a security consideration. because that data is in motion and it's, you know, definitely being transferred in many different ways depending on the situation. So that's wonderful, Jean. Thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone. If you would like to ask a question, by all means, hop right in and you can do so. Are there any questions out there?
Questions?
For Kim or Lou or Connor or Jean?
This is Roger. I have no questions, but I do appreciate everyone's insights and experience. It's wonderful of you to have shared some of these thoughts. I really do appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, Kim. Sorry, I mean, Amy, if I could jump in.
Yeah.
One thing I want to say is for anyone that's listening to this, we've just given you probably a list of 100 things that you could look after at least. And sometimes it can be overwhelming. And that's really the point is it's not as overwhelming if you approach it methodically. You have outcomes that you're looking at. Obviously, this is something we do to help companies out to make sense of all this jumble, all these acronyms, etc. So I would say don't get overwhelmed. If you're a telemedicine company that's just starting to go down this path, this is not as hard as it looks. I think the really overwhelming message here is that you should be looking at security, and you will get the compliance afterwards, no matter what it is that you're going after.
And Lou, if you don't mind me adding to something, you know, I don't know who all is online and if they're specifically with telemedicine companies, but for those that might be online that are working with payers or are providers, you know, having someone come in to help you create your survey or how you're going to gauge and evaluate telemedicine companies, you know, please consider that, because there's a lot to look at, a lot to consider. And when you use a company such as CDG, they can help you to create that survey so that when you are gauging and doing your due diligence on any type of supply chain or vendor that's coming in, a telemedicine company coming in that you want to bring into your organization or integrate with, there is that due diligence part, and they can be quite helpful with that. So there's that other part to it that I wanted to mention as well, Lou.
Thanks, Kim.
That's great. Well, moving forward, we would love to, you know, answer any one-on-one questions that you have. So following the session, we can send out the recording just so you can refer back to it if you'd like. And then if you'd like to ask any questions of CDG or any of the panelists moving forward, we can make those connections for you as well. So thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
And hey, Amy, if I could actually ask one quick
Sure,
question.
Sam, no problem.
Sure, and this is open to really everyone that has spoken. It was really a great overview of the subject of the problems. As you're going through the process of trying to integrate your development, your application, your app dev teams, what have you seen as to be the most effective way to really communicate? It's not a problem like you were saying, not a hammer, but something where you're trying to give them an opportunity to break through with a new solution. Is that work groups? Is that the training and secure coding? Which way did you find best to try and, I guess, to eat the elephant?
I could respond. This is
Please.
a huge problem, primarily because secure coding is still not taught in colleges, and not assuming every engineer goes through college. Maybe they come up through a different path, but it's still to this day self-taught, and it's usually through experience that they ultimately get better at programming around secure coding. But you absolutely, as an organization, need to include, you know, these software security initiatives into your software development lifecycle. And part of that is your threat modeling, your secure coding, your training. The types of training that are usually tend to be very successful are ones that are computer-based, so CBT training. Because if you have let's say a contractor workforce, problem is there might be a huge turnover. So you might keep introducing the same, vulnerabilities back into the system again. So you want to make sure that, that they're going through some kind of secure coding training from the very beginning before they ever even touch your code. And that's important. And there's some that you can purchase. You can go with, these tools that are already available, or you can create some CBT training online if you have some LMS system. That's really, really important. The other thing is, again, it's understanding that, I don't know if you've heard of BSIM, that's Business Information Security Management Model. OWASP has kind of their own, but it really talks about what are the security software initiatives that you need to implement into your SDL. So I highly recommend that maybe you go take a look at the BSIM framework, and you can see all the touch points of the areas that you really need to address. That should be a starting point.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you, Kim.
And I'd like just to comment on that as well, because what Kim said was very true about the training, Sam. But two of the things that you could see, depending on how your organization is structured, if you're following the squads and guilds style model of breaking up everyone to support particular services, then one thing I've seen work really well is in each one of those groups of developers who is supporting a particular service in your development lifecycle, you have a security champion inside of that, and somebody who's got more senior expertise around that. Doesn't have to carry a security title, but has to definitely have a skill set and a passion for championing security. I mean, their realm of influence is at 5 or 6 people who are really focused on the code development for that particular service. So a championship model, and when you combine that with a leaderboard inside your organization, depending how gamification you want to get this on your services, that will really motivate people, because nobody wants to come in last. And so by publishing it out like that, there is a way where you can, once you've empowered them with the knowledge, as Kim was saying, with the training, you can come around the other side with the accountability. And that's things like the leaderboards and publicly rewarding security champions for stepping up and taking action.
That's a great point. That's a really good point. And to add on that, if that's the approach you take, think outside the box. In other words, if you're using some kind of vulnerability scanning tool, say Checkmarx or Veracode or whatever, and all of a sudden you get a list of, say, 50 vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities are, 90% of them are, 50% are cross-site scripting, and the other 50% are injection flaws. That are traditionally the way we've gone to fix them is, okay, if it's a critical, it has to be fixed in 3 days. That just doesn't work. It's not working. And so maybe instead think of, this month we're going to focus just on cross-site scripting. It doesn't matter if it's a P1 or a P2, we're only going to focus on fixing cross-site scripting. Next month, we'll fix only injection flaws. So be creative, think outside the box. Don't let other, if a scan comes back and says this is automatically P1, don't automatically accept that. Do your due diligence, really talk about, is it really a P1, and can we have, train on a vulnerability category and patch on one, as opposed to, just based on their, prioritization of a P1 or P2.
And also, if I may add just a little bit to this, is I think also this issue is or this problem is changing, or perspective is changing, because I definitely see in the last few years, I see a lot more interest from developers to learn about secure coding, because this is what today is the market demand. You see more and more, right, job description for developers where employers want developers to know how to do secure coding. So they see it as additional benefit, and I actually see a lot of developers interested in learning secure coding.
And also, all these ideas are coming. I was going to say too, implementing this in the creating a secure development lifecycle. Do not forget QA. Our problem is that most of our QA analysts are not trained in how to do security testing. So it's really not integrated into that process, and it should be. And again, going to what Jean says is that if QA analysts can learn how to do some element of security testing and include that in their functional testing, that makes them more marketable, and it makes your software development lifecycle, more robust. And so think of the QA analyst as well, not just the software engineers.
Very good.
Great
Thank
point.
you.
But before we drop, yeah, I just want to make the point that I always make the analogy when we're talking about software developers and security. They're like, especially this is relevant for healthcare, doctors and nutrition. They get maybe an elective, right, when they're going through med school. But how important is nutrition when you're looking at a patient and the body? Same with developers. If they are lucky enough to take an elective for security, it's usually not adequate, and that's all they get before they're kind of released to do all of this important code. So that analogy, I think, holds true, and hopefully that'll change.
Great, everyone. Well, we really appreciate your time. Again, we are here for you. So look forward to more panels. We will have more content coming your way on telemedicine specifically, as well as how we can get everyone back to the office and back to normalcy, or at least a new normal sooner than later. So stay tuned for that, and appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Jean.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Lou.